Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Samantha, a Year 2 history student. So welcome to the School of Humanities History mini lecture on food, imperialism, and globalization. That is a mouthful. Okay, so today we also have Matthew here, who's also a fellow student ambassador from the history program. And obviously we have Prof. Harlan Stevens, who will be conducting the lecture. So prior to starting, just a few reminders. Before we proceed with today's session, I would like to remind participants who have yet to change your display name to kindly change it to your full name. And you can do so by following these simple steps on the screen. Okay, so I'll just let it linger for a while for you guys. So next, we also have a few house rules for this virtual session. So please spend some time to read through them and just acquaint yourself with it. Okay, if you're all ready, I think we can start. So let me invite Professor Harlan to actually kickstart this session. Hi, Prof. Harlan.
Hi there, how are you going? Can you hear me?
Yes, all
Great.
good.
So I have some slides to share, so I will go ahead and do that. So this lecture actually has kind of two parts to it. And what I'm going to do is for the first kind of 10 or 15 minutes, so I have about 40 minutes, I think, and for the first 10 or 15 minutes, I'm going to just talk about the history program in general and what kinds of things we do in the history program and how I think it's unique, and a little bit of what you can do with the history degree after you graduate from the history program. And then in the second part of the lecture, I'm going to talk about really the topic that is in the title, Food, Imperialism, and Globalization. This is part of, this is a lecture from a class that I teach about food in history, which is called Feasting and Fasting. And it's just a kind of a little sneak preview. I won't get to do a kind of hugely detailed lecture because we don't have time here today, but it will give you a little bit of a taste of what's in that class. And I look forward to your questions at the end, either questions about the history program, or which I'm sure the students can also help me to answer, or questions about my lecture. I'm also happy to answer those as well. So a brief kind of overview of the history program and what we do. As most of you know, it's already, presumably, it's a 4-year program in which you get an honors degree at the end. So we call that direct honors. And I would say that over the last few years, we have introduced a kind of increasing level of flexibility into these degrees. So although you would come here to study history, actually history is only kind of one part of what you would study in your sort of broader degree. There are all kinds of ways in which you in fact need to go outside of the history discipline in your broadening, what's going to be called, used to be called unrestricted electives, and are now called broadening electives that really allow you to branch out into other parts of the university. There are also, now we have introduced history that will be together with 5 double major programs. So there's history and philosophy, history and Chinese, history and linguistics, history and English literature. So all of these double, you can now apply not only for history itself and study history as a kind of standalone degree, but now as part of all these double major programs as well. We also have numerous, so if you don't want to do a double major, if you're not sort of that committed to 2 subjects and you still want to focus mainly on history, we have a range of minor programs as well. This is actually at NTU only means taking 5 courses to get a minor. And that can be any other discipline within the School of Humanities, but there are other things that you can take minors in as well that are kind of specialized. So we have a minor in gender studies, for example. We have a minor in urban studies. We have a minor in geography. We have a minor in science and technology studies. We have a minor in art history. So there's a lot to choose from. And, you know, I don't, even know all of the whole list of minors that are possible, because there's actually quite a lot of them. The students who are entering this August will also be the pioneer batch of our new interdisciplinary core program as well. And this is a set of core courses that has been introduced across all of the undergraduates at the university, or will be introduced this August across all of the undergraduates. So these are courses across a range of topics. They include courses on sustainability, on well-being and health, on our digital world, on science and technology. So there's a range of courses that cover a range of disciplines. And the innovative aspect of those courses is that you, in fact, be in those courses with students not just from the School of Humanities or from our college, but in fact from students from engineering, students from sciences, and students from business, and so on. So this is where the interdisciplinary part comes in. You have a chance to mix with other students across the university in these same courses. And I'm actually involved in the process of designing one of those new courses. So I can tell you a little bit about that if you like. A new thing that's also coming, I mean, internships are not new to us, but what is coming as part of this core program is also mandatory internships. So in fact, you will be, at some point in your degree, you will have to do an internship. So that, in a sense, that seems like it actually reduces flexibility, but I think that, in fact, the benefit of it is that this is going to help you to find jobs and lead to opportunities beyond the university. So we see this new internship as a very positive kind of step. What can you expect actually in the history courses itself? So there are kind of two parts to your history major or history degree. One is the so-called core courses, and those are listed on the slide. In fact, there are basically, you can see that there are 7 there, but in fact there's only 6 of them, because the Asia Pacific pre-1800 and Asia Pacific post-1800 you either take one or the other. So you have to take one of those. We have an introductory course called What is History? We have a course on Singapore history. We have a course on science, the history of science, tech, and medicine, which is a core course. We have a kind of methods course, which usually people take in their 3rd year, which introduces you in more detail to sort of the methods and methodologies of history. That course is called historiography. And then we have a final year project, which is a 2-semester course for most of our students. Not all of our students do that, but most of our students do a final year project. So that's the core of our program. And then beyond that, we have what are called prescribed electives. And what I really want to stress here is the huge diversity of those elective courses, the major elective courses. So they're broadly split into 4 categories that you can see there: global Asia, interdisciplinary history, world history, and applied history. But just to give you a kind of taste of what kinds of courses we have here, I mean, I'm happy to answer more questions about this, but we have courses in the history of medicine, courses in history of science, courses in history of technology, environmental history courses. We have courses about the history of gender and sexuality. We have courses about the history of sort of media and film. We have courses, I teach a course about the history of computing, the history of the internet, the history of sport. So we really pride ourselves on, tackling history as a subject, a kind of all-encompassing subject, right? In some ways that, things that you didn't maybe even think had a history, right? I think often when you study history in JC, you wouldn't be usually studying something like the history of sport. People even don't imagine that kind of sport has a history that is important. But we think kind of the history of ordinary people's lives, sort of what people do with their lives, how they live, what they eat, how they worship, how their family, who are their families, and who do they kind of live with, right? All of these are questions about everyday life. We call this kind of social history. And we place a huge emphasis on that kind of history, social and cultural history, in our program. And we think that that is a kind of important and kind of unique factor of our history program here at NTU. I just want to give you some examples. I've sort of picked some topics here, they're sort of almost at random. I pulled these off my shelf a while ago of actually FYPs that I've graded and wrote down. These are not the actual exact titles, but these are giving you a sense of the varied topics. I'm always myself surprised at how interesting and innovative our students come up with FYP topics. And this just gives you a sense of the diversity of where our students end up doing research on. So North Korean art, Japanese films, closer to home, the history of hawkers in Singapore, national songs in Singapore, computer games, festivals and temples, the history of the advertising of Tiger beer. So very diverse and interesting FYP projects. And I think this is a kind of also a good example, or should give you a good indication of the kinds of things that our students come out interested in, that that we have hopefully inspired in some kind of way. Excuse me. I often usually get a lot of questions in fora like this about assessment. What's the assessment like in history courses? My answer is usually that it is extremely varied, that there are all kinds of different assessments. Different professors have different styles and different ways of running their classes, and different ways of assessing their materials. We don't have a kind of a formula that says you must have this and this and this and this. But of course we believe that writing history essays is important. Learning how to write history essays is important. So of course we have history essays, but in most courses you will find a range of other types of assessments as well. And I've listed some of those out on the slide. Some of them are writing, sort of like magazine articles, white papers, so policy documents, right? But some of them, blogs, I guess, is also a written kind of thing, although in a very different style. But some of them are much more based on either oral presentation or visual presentation, right? We see history is also something that can be, exhibited, performed, and that can be communicated visually as well. We actually have several courses in what we call public history, which is how to communicate history to a wider public audience. And so we believe those are important skills to develop as well, and skills that we think will serve you well in your future profession. I also want to say a word about what kinds of jobs people come out of history degrees and then do. I always say to students, well, if you want to be an aerospace engineer, then the choice is very clear. You should go and study aerospace engineering. And if you want to be an accountant, the choice is also very clear. And you should go and study accounting. But for many of us, including me when I entered university, we don't know what we might want to do. We're not sure. The job that, for all we know, the job that we might do in the future hasn't even been invented yet, right? The world of work is changing very quickly. So I think that history is a degree that can provide a great deal of flexibility in what kinds of skills that you develop and where those can be applied. The kinds of research, communication, data analysis, kinds of skills, writing skills, that are very broadly applicable. And I think that's borne out in the kinds of industries that our students have gone into. You can see a kind of breakdown on this slide of the different industries, but we've had students go into journalism, into education and teaching, into various kinds of business, into things like magazines, into a whole range of industries that really cover the whole spectrum. Obviously, government, civil service of all kinds here in Singapore. We have close connections with museums, with libraries, with archives here in Singapore. Many of our students do internships in those kinds of places. So people who are interested in those kinds of fields, certainly history is suitable. Happy to answer more questions about all of that. This is really a kind of pretty quick summary, but at least gives you a bit of an overview of what we're all about. And now I want to turn to actually this topic here. Again, as I promised, just a kind of sample of what we do and the kinds of things that we talk about in our history program here. And I thought Food is a kind of nice example. It's maybe one of those things that, we think about food as kind of ordinary, right? And everybody eats, everybody's got to eat, and we've got to eat every day. And so sometimes it's imagined that food, is just something that we take for granted, right? That it's not so important. But at my course, I want to show that food is a kind of has an important history, and that history is very impactful on, many, many aspects of our lives. And so here I want to talk about how food fits into kind of global history. And what I mean by that is how food has forged connections. I don't mean I'm going to tell a kind of history of the whole globe here. I'm going to talk about how food has forged connections between different parts of the globe, between different parts of the world. And you can immediately perhaps imagine the ways in which food is traded, the ways in which food is exchanged, the ways in which eating, recipes are exchanged, has formed over the course of history a very important ways in which culture has been exchanged, and a very important ways in which ideas and people have kind of moved around with food and with recipes. And so this food forms a kind of important part of the ways in which kind of we connect to one another around the world. And perhaps the kind of most obvious example of that, and the one I'm going to focus on here a little bit, is the spice trade, right? And here, this connects to the second word in my kind of title here, imperialism, right? Because beginning in about 1450, when Europe began to kind of go out and explore various parts of the world, including this part of the world, right, into Asia, a lot of that exploration and a lot of that kind of building of empire was at least initially driven by food, right? And in particular, the kinds of foods that we call spices. So in fact, this very, very valuable, what became a very, very valuable food, was driving this form of connection and this form of kind of globalization right from the kind of middle of the 15th century onwards. I want to, though, before we get to even talking about Europe, just say something about the kind of longer history of this kind of trade. Even in the ancient world, spices were known quite well. And here you can see a map of the ancient kind of spice routes. And you can see they connect places like Southeast Asia, Java there, right? Also this part of the world, the Straits of Malacca, via India, up through the Arabic world and through Egypt into the Mediterranean and Europe. So that's the so-called maritime Silk Road. And then the overland routes marked in red there, the land Silk Road, right? In which basically spices were coming along these routes, with a lot of the trade being controlled through India and through the Arab world as well, through chains of merchants, right, that would sell these spices on from kind of one person to the next, and eventually they would end up in parts of Europe. So the Roman Empire, so as long ago as before the Common Era, right? So into the sort of BC, we have spices being traded. Cloves, for example, we find traded into places in the Roman Empire. So this is coming through along these kinds of routes that you can see right there. A lot of this is, perhaps not so surprisingly, dominated by China. There's evidence of India also plays a very important role. The Arab world also plays a very important role. But China controls this trade for a long time. There's evidence of cinnamon which comes from Sri Lanka, right in the middle of the map there, being in China as long ago as 2700 BCE. But by the Han Dynasty, China controls a kind of network of trade that you can see in these lines in red here, that extends all the way down into this part of the world, into Southeast Asia, and to ports on the eastern coast of India. And then those, as we saw in the last slide too, these are kind of picked up by traders in the Indian world and the Arab world, and taken on towards places like Egypt and into Europe. So really, in some sense, when we talk about the kind of history of spice trade in general, we should be talking about a kind of Chinese, Indian, and Arabic trade. That's the kind of very long history of this trade. This is then picked up after the kind of fall of the Roman Empire, after the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century in the 5th century AD. Basically, this is picked up in particular by the Islamic world, and you can see that this is the Ottoman Empire marked in green there, and then you can see this kind of network that covers the Mediterranean here. That is a network that is dominated by Islamic traders who built a network again based on kind of religious affiliation in particular that extended all the way from the Malay world, so again this part of the world, right through into Spain, which was also dominated by Islam at that time, right? It was a Moorish country. It was an Arab and Islamic empire. So you can see again that this is, so the medieval spice trade is actually something that is dominated not by Europe, but in fact by the Islamic world, and that this only begins to change in the time of the Crusades. So in the 12th and 13th century, Europe, when European basically armies attempt to go to basically the Levant, so this the Near East here, so parts of what is now Israel and Palestine and Syria and Lebanon and so forth, and liberate the cities from attempt to liberate those cities from Islamic control, and basically get a taste for spices that they then bring back to Europe, right? And these spices become increasingly important in Europe in the 13th and 14th centuries, especially traded through the Italian city-states like Genoa here and Venice. You can see Venice is an important node in this network on this map. By the 15th century, basically, this has become a kind of craze in Europe, a craze for spices, and this is a kind of, I sometimes say in my class, like, we have kind of in our culture, we have kind of Lamborghinis and kind of Prada handbags to show off kind of how wealthy we are, right? You want to show conspicuous consumption, then, you buy a fancy car or a fancy piece of jewelry. For medieval Europeans, you bought a lot of spices, and you can see this is the kind of shopping list for one wedding banquet in the 15th century. I believe this is from France, southern part of France. So 205 pounds of cinnamon, so about 100 kilograms of cinnamon, 85 pounds of nutmeg, 50 kilograms of cloves, almost 200 kilograms of black pepper. I mean, this is an absurd amount of spices, right? We would never use this amount. But you can see the kind of voracious appetite that the Europeans began to have for these kinds of spices. And when things go into this kind of demand, the price goes up, right? Everybody wants them, and so there's money to be made. And so some European monarchs, especially in Spain and Portugal, begin to say, hey, we don't like basically the Italians, the Genoans and the Venetians dominating this trade. So let's go and find our own way around to where these spices come from. And so they begin, especially the Portuguese, who are very, very good seafarers, begin to figure out how to get, first of all, down into the open seas. And first of all, they begin to trade slaves and gold in that on the west coast of Africa there. You can see the sort of line on the top left there, sort of over here. But then they also realize that, again, that there's money to be made in spices if they can get all the way around the Cape, the Horn of Africa, all the way around the Cape of Africa and the Horn of Africa, and make it all the way to India. They don't really have a really good sense of where India is. Vasco da Gama sets out in 1497 with a kind of vague idea that he's going to make it to a place called Calicut. He kind of thinks maybe it's somewhere near Ethiopia. Sort of right, but also not so close. But he makes it there. It takes him almost a year of voyaging around the Cape of Good Hope, but he makes it there. And what he manages to do is not immediately to dominate the spice trade, but rather to plug himself and the Portuguese into a network of spice trading that, as we've seen, has already existed for maybe even at this point, thousands of years. And when he reaches Calicut, and he really has nothing to trade with the Indian, basically, Raja there. But the Indian Raja is actually kind of generous and sends him back with some spices and a letter to the King of Portugal, showing that he's willing to trade. And he says, Vasco da Gama, gentlemen of your household, so this letter is addressed to the King of Portugal, came to my land, and I rejoiced at that. In my land there is much cinnamon and much cloves and ginger and pepper and many precious stones. And what I want from your land is gold and silver and coral and scarlet cloth. So very, very quickly, he's ready to trade, right? This is not, he has already he knows what's going on here, right? And basically the Portuguese become just one more player in these kind of vast networks of trade that stretch, as we've seen, all the way from China to the Middle East. Portugal expands this trade or this network very quickly. Although I should say that although they rapidly spread out, and you can see that, in the space of, in another 5 years, they're in Ceylon or Sri Lanka. By 1511 in this part of the world, right? Just, a short drive from here up the coast to Malacca, right? By 1513 in Ternate, which is now part of in Indonesia. And by 1570 in Japan, right? So very, very rapidly, just in the space of 70 years, have a network that stretches across all of Asia. But we shouldn't overestimate the influence that they had. They remained, although sometimes very belligerent and like to get into wars and try to take over cities and try to hold trade by force, they were only marginally successful at this, it's fair to say, only marginally successful at this, and were often defeated and couldn't hold on to the trade as much as they would have liked. There's some estimates that say on the west coast of India, even at the height of their powers, the Portuguese were only 10% of the trade in spices, just to give you some kind of an idea. But nevertheless, an expanding kind of network that connected Europe back to, or connected Asia with European traders in this kind of network. So much for Portugal. I want to also talk about Spain, because Spain is a little bit of a different case here and has a different kind of influence, a very important kind of influence on the world of food and the world of eating and on diet, but in a very different kind of way than just spices. So as probably most of you know, as I like to teach people in American schools, they say in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? So in 1492, Columbus went across the Atlantic, but as you may also probably know, he was not expecting to run into America. He also wanted to find spices. He thought that Japan was right near the Canary Islands. So he thought Japan was kind of in the Atlantic somewhere, and that very quickly he would run into basically what is now kind of Indonesia, right? The Spice Islands. So he thought he could sail west rather than south and east around Africa, and very quickly find a route to the Spice Islands. So, often we sometimes are taught that Columbus and people in the 15th century thought that the world was flat. This was not true. He knew that the world was round. He just seriously underestimated its size. He thought it was much smaller than it is, and hence he thought Japan was right near the middle of the Atlantic. So instead, he runs into Cuba. He runs into what we now call the Caribbean, and looking for spices. In fact, he thinks he finds some spices. He thinks Cuba. He basically thinks Cuba is part of Japan. He still doesn't realize even when he gets there, and he thinks that in fact, even some of the things he's found and he takes back, he thinks that they're spices. Turns out that they're not. But what he does find is all kinds of other things, including lots and lots of gold, and lots of other, he finds lots of things in the New World, and that's a long history, but he finds lots of other foods that become very, very important to the world in general. So chocolate is a good example, is a new world food. Today we call these new world foods the tomato, the potato, maize or corn, the chili pepper or capsicum plant, squash or pumpkin, that whole variety, the turkey, right? And sugar. Sugar is actually, I have a little star on that because sugar is in fact from Southeast Asia, but it is importantly mostly cultivated in the New World in America. So sugar kind of comes from the New World in some sense. So Columbus, and this is actually known in history as the Columbian Exchange. And the Columbian Exchange happens in the years after 1492, when basically Columbus brings back all of these goods, not immediately, of course, but over a period of decades and even centuries, brings back and introduces these crops and these plants into Europe and into Africa and other parts of the world as well. And then they spread outwards from there. And this is hugely important for a whole variety of reasons. In particular, the fact that plants like corn, basically corn grows where it is too dry for rice, and also where it is too wet for wheat. So corn you can plant, it's a very, very hardy plant, and you can suddenly feed many more people. Convert what is formerly land that will not grow anything into land that will grow things. The potato as well. Potatoes grow in incredibly poor soil and also at high altitude. So places where you just couldn't grow anything before, now you can grow lots and lots of stuff. I mean, the history of Ireland is basically, based on the potato, right? It's a little unfair perhaps, but Ireland is basically made by the potato. So this causes a huge kind of population explosion in Europe. And many historians have argued that the kind of shift in population growth in Europe is not necessarily to do with science and technology or medicine or curing disease, but rather to do with the new availability of foods that are crossing the Atlantic. And this has an effect on not only not only sort of what we eat, what people taste, right, what people's diets are, but also on just people's ability to receive nutrition, right? And this is going to play an important factor in Europe's kind of growing power from the 17th century kind of onwards, right? As we know, Europe becomes to sort of dominate more and more of the planet, sort of militarily and through its empires. And partly this is due to its strength of its food base, which is partly coming through the Columbian Exchange. So again, potatoes actually from Peru, and you can see the variety of potatoes that come from Peru. Another effect of this is to think about what effect it's having on diet and taste here, right? And just try to imagine Italian food without tomatoes, right? It's impossible, right? It's impossible to imagine really what the Italian diet would have looked like before you could have like a nice kind of tomato sauce on your pasta noodles or a nice tomato base on your kind of pizza. The amount in which this influenced the taste of Europeans, I think, is just astonishing, right? How people's diets changed, became more varied, and people's tastes changed. They just started to eat a wider variety of stuff, and they're kind of now what we think of traditional foods actually have only been around. These kinds of foods have only been around in Europe since the Columbian Exchange. We might think also something like, even this had an influence on this part of the world. Think of Thai food without the chili pepper, right? It doesn't make any sense to think about, what would Thai food be without the chili pepper, right? But of course, that was true right up until, after the Columbian Exchange, where these plants were traded all over the world, right? This became a kind of global network of trade in not only foods themselves, right, like dried foods like spices, but in fact in plants, right? So the plants themselves were traded and then grown in different parts of the world. Obviously chilies are grown everywhere, tomatoes are grown all over the world, potatoes are grown all over the world, corn is grown all over the world, right? Corn is now a big food in China, right? Yeah. So these things spread out very, very rapidly and change people's tastes as well. What goes along with that I'm kind of arguing here is changing kind of power and economic relationships. That this creates basically ways as diets change and as people's demand for food increases, this creates a whole new way of kind of a whole new economy and a whole new set of economic relations that basically puts Europe in a kind of driver's seat position. And one of these is one of the most important of these, certainly not the only one that's driven by this Columbian exchange, is the rise of the so-called triangle trade. And as you can see, there's a kind of vague triangle on my slide here, with the sort of this orange, yellow, and then sort of the pink here. And this trade is basically that basically ships would go from Europe and especially England, taking, as you can see there, guns and cloth and raw materials like iron, but also processed materials like beer to Africa, where they would be traded there for slaves, where the slaves would then be transported in the so-called Middle Passage across the Atlantic, mostly to the Caribbean islands, the so-called West Indies, also up into the southern states of North America. Obviously, sort of the most famous area where slavery persisted for a long time. A lot of this was growing things like tobacco, cotton, and also sugar. Sugar and was refined into molasses, which was then taken up into the ports in the north, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, where it was made into more finished goods like rum, for example. And then these were then traded sometimes on the same ships back across to Europe and England, where they were sold once again. So basically these merchants were making profits on all three kind of legs of the triangle. But what's kind of important here for our story is how food kind of figures into ultimately what becomes a kind of mass relocation of people, right? A mass relocation, in this case, of people across the Atlantic in the slave trade. This is a wholesale, so not only the mixing of diets, but the huge kind of progression of people across the Atlantic from Africa that has fundamentally influenced not just taste and not just what people eat, but in fact the kind of whole cultural makeup of the continents of the two continents of America, right? South and North America. A lot of slaves went to South America as well, and it's not shown on this map, but that happened as well. So this changing economic relationships to do with food created hugely basically shifts in power in favor of Europe. So this is my last slide, and just by way of summary here, I want to kind of contrast for a second the kind of Portuguese version of this story and the Spanish version, right? So here, in the Portuguese version, we have a kind of changes in the European diet, a preference for spices that begins a kind of global trade, right? That basically creates a kind of early version of globalization that connects Europe and Asia. Not the dominance of Europe at this point, perhaps that begins to happen with later empires, especially the English and the Dutch, but a kind of global connection that begins to happen. The Spanish also are looking for spices, but they don't really find them. Instead, they discover a whole bunch of other foods that fundamentally transform the diet and fundamentally transform nutrition of Europe and other parts of the world. And I would argue has a huge effect on kind of global power relations over the next several centuries. So this is really just kind of skimming the surface of this long story. And this is, there are lots of stories, sort of micro stories that one could tell here about, how the chili pepper moved around, or, how palm oil moved from West Africa to, to be planted in Southeast Asia. So there are lots of little stories, but what I want to sort of the main message here is this kind of interconnection between food and diet, what we eat, what we prefer to eat, and these kind of larger stories about globalization and trade and power. And I think what I'm trying to do here is tell these stories together and make the point that we have to tell these stories, food and stories about economic and power relations, at the same time. Thanks. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Prof. Hallam. So now moving on to the Q&A session. Joining me and Prof. Hallam in answering your questions, we also have Matthew. So we'll be addressing the questions sent to us during the registration period. So thank you all for those that sent in your questions. Thank you for your enthusiastic participation. So we welcome more questions, and if you would like to raise any, please send them in via the Zoom chat box, or if you're on YouTube, via Slido. So you can also click on the raise hand button and I will call your name, in which if I do, please unmute and switch on your camera to ask your questions. So for participants who are viewing this session from the Open House microsite, you can also send in your questions to us via Slido. So let's keep the session informal and feel free to bounce off questions to us. So the first question that we got was, and this is directed to Prof. Hallam. So if I took history as an A-level subject, will I have an advantage?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, I think that I would say not necessarily. I think always it's helpful to know kind of more history, right? It can maybe help you to start with a little bit of a base, but I think actually it's not necessarily an advantage. We have lots of students who come from poly. We have lots of students who come from other JC courses where they've never taken history at all. And you know, they do perfectly well in our program. In fact, many of our better students, in fact, I think at the end of 4 years often don't have history backgrounds. And you know, I don't think there's anything that doesn't say anything particularly, except that you know, we have a very wide variety of students coming into our degree. And yeah, I mean, I would say the way we teach history here and the way we do history here and our kind of unique approaches that we have makes it sufficiently different from what you would study in JC that it won't necessarily give you an advantage. So perhaps either of you would like to add to that. I don't know.
Would you like to add anything, Matthew?
Personally, I was actually a JC student, yeah, before I entered NTU. So I would say that there aren't any advantage per se, because I think the sort of history that's offered at NTU University is actually very different from A-level history. Yeah, I think for A-level history, we focus mainly on political history. But as Prof. Moff has shared, you know, we can actually study about history of food, history of gender. History is so much more general and so much broader than just political history itself. So even if you haven't taken A-level history, don't have to worry, you won't be disadvantaged. Yeah, everyone will be a fair playing field because this sort of history is quite different. Yeah.
I think I can share sentiments with that. So unlike Matthew, I'm from the poly background. So my diploma was quite a bit different from what I'm doing now. So I'm majoring history, but my diploma was in arts business management. So there is similarities because we did do art history when I was in poly, and that was one of the reasons why I chose to actually come to uni to actually major in history, because I was interested in curatorial works and museum management. But I don't think that just because you are for JC or like you have like a certain advantage, ultimately I think it depends on you and your interest and passion in the subject itself. At the end of the day, I do believe that passion kind of triumphs all. So if you do have a deep passion for the subject, I do think you would have an advantage nonetheless. Yeah. So moving on to the next question. I think it was a bit partially addressed by Matthew just now, but it's also directed to Prof. Stephen. So how is university history different from JC history?
Yeah, I mean, I think I covered also a little in my intro, right? About you know, this focus on what we call social and cultural history, right? Another way of perhaps framing that is, I would say a couple of things. One, we might call a lot of history. I don't want to characterize the JC curriculum too harshly, but I think a lot of history that you learn in kind of high schools anywhere is what we might call political history or top-down history, right? I mean, it's often the history of old dead men, mostly, you sometimes we can add white men in there, and it's generals, prime ministers, kings, whatever, religious leaders. The list goes on, right? These kind of and that history is important, and it shouldn't be ignored. It's important. Sometimes it's also called diplomatic history, right? The kind of relationships between the great states, right, and how kind of wars were fought and diplomacy conducted, and this kind of history based on kind of international relations, right, with the nation state as really at the center, and that has its place in time. And there are definitely things that we do that are along those lines. We teach, Cold War history, and we do have some courses that are kind of, history of Korea, history of Japan, that are focused on very national kind of topics in a way. But I would say that that's not the focus of what we do. And we like to think of history as not as just focused on the nation state, right? Not just as a national history, not just history of Singapore, then history of Japan, then history of the United States, then history of Australia, then history of Zimbabwe. Like we find that maybe gets a bit boring, and the kind of thing I just tried to do in my talk, where we see these very interconnected stories, right, that go all over the world and are connected with one another. And that are also stories about, ordinary people, again, right? The sort of bottom up rather than top down. What did people eat? How do people worship? These kinds of, what do people do for fun and in their leisure time? These kinds of stories are really how we see kind of what is kind of interesting about the kind of history we do.
So the next question is actually directed towards Matthew, and it is, what made you decide to study history?
Oh, okay. So the reason why I choose history is because I'll say it's out of interest. Because I've always been interested in history, and I want to learn more about history itself. And I think Samantha, you can also answer the question. So what's the reason why you choose to study history?
For me personally, I've always been interested in history since secondary school. It's just that I didn't want to go to JC. Instead, I just chose to go to poly because I was more interested in museums and doing, like I mentioned just now, curatorial and exhibition management. And it was one of the pathways that was a bit different from JC, and I wanted to explore that. Ultimately, I chose to come back to uni to major in history because I just have a very deep interest in museums, but right now it's also been expanded. I'm like really interested in world issues nowadays, like looking at political issues, issues of sovereignty. So it kind of, I would say that so far that my 2 years in NTU kind of widened my passion in history, because it's no more a singular view of why, oh, I just wanted to work in a museum. But now I'm looking at more different areas of how history can kind of shape different aspects of life and civilization. Yep. So
yeah, maybe I would just add something there. I mean, I stressed this point before about, how history is a kind of, it's not, doesn't have a clear route to anything, right? In some ways, unless you want to become a historian, but most people don't. Most people don't wake up one morning and say, I want to be a historian, right? But they may have an interest in history, and of course that interest is very important. But I think, next to that, the other important thing is perhaps that it can take you in many, many directions, right? And we believe that the skills that are built in the program, research, communication skills, sometimes people call these, sometimes at NTU, people call these soft skills. I hate that term. I don't know why they're soft, right? But because actually they're, that implies kind of soft. We think of weak, right? In fact, I don't think these are weak. These are very, very important skills in everything from kind of business to, being a historian, right? Like, I think that, so this prepares you in a kind of a general way. And I think, this is a kind of, in some ways, that what I think of as a very good generalist degree, right? It can lead in many, many different directions, and it is what you make it in some ways, right? If you want to make it something that leads you into marketing and advertising, as it has for some students, then you can do that, right? I mean, you notice that one of those FYPs that I had up there was about the history of Tiger beer advertising, right? And that student actually went on, and she now works in marketing. She ended up with a job in like a marketing department of a big firm. So, you know, you can make it into a lot of different things.
So we have a question from one of the attendees on Zoom, I believe. So Sean wants to ask, I wanted to ask how viable is a history degree at NTU towards embarking on a postgraduate or academic route? My interest lies in the history of religion, and I would like to aim to do a PhD in that area in the future. So Prof. Harlem, I think this is a question for you.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's actually very viable. I mean, I guess a couple of things to say about that. One, we have placed students into a number of postgraduate programs overseas. So we have, I believe, still a student. He is went on to do a master's and then now is doing a PhD at Oxford. We have students who have gone on to study. I believe we have one student pursuing postgraduate studies in Israel. We have another student who is at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in the UK. So quite a number of examples of students who have gone on to postgraduate studies. Some of those students, it's also one route into that, certainly not the only route, is to actually pursue a master's degree with us as well. So several of our students have gone on from the BA program into our master's program, and then hope to actually study, then do a PhD overseas. And I think that is a possible route as well. With regards to your specific question about history of religion, I think we're very well placed, actually. We have Prof. Nick Witkowski is a historian of religion. That's his kind of full-time job, but there's several other faculty who I would say are also whose work relate perhaps a little bit more around the fringes of the history of religion as well. So it actually is quite a strength for us. So yeah, I would say I'm happy to talk to you more about that, but I think it's very viable.
So another question we have is, I believe we got this on Slido, and the question was actually, how is history different from NUS? But we are not really in the place or position to talk to you about another university's program because we're not really knowledgeable about that. So we can only kind of talk to you about what NTU offers because that's what we are here for today. So I hope that answers your question. And I think it has been answered along the way with whatever Prof. Harlem has mentioned, as well as Matthew and I. And I hope that kind of gives you some insight on how NTU's history program is. So one of the other questions we actually got was, any unique or interesting modules offered? And Matthew, do you want to share whether you took any interesting modules?
Oh, okay, sure. So I think whether is it interesting or not, I think it's still very subjective. So it depends on where your interest lies. So for me, I find general history interesting. So for me, I've taken modules on gender and history, and I also taken modules on history of migration, history of science and technology. And basically, all these topics are pretty different from what you actually expect from what you will study in history. So maybe I can elaborate on gender history. So as you can, there's this recent thing, about transgenderism. So on gender history, actually address the topics on transgender as well. So for example, we did a reading about how streets in Bugis, right, how it gradually became where this transgender community used to occupy Bugis Street, and then after decades, due to government intervention, they were sort of being chased out of Bugis, and it was more controlled, and how transgender became more and more being covered by the state. So this is just an example or a sample, of the various different diverse topic kind of courses that's being offered in NTU. And how about you, Samantha? Have you encountered any courses that you find that's very interesting for you? Yeah.
So I think one of the courses that I took recently last semester that really interested me was the history of the Malay world. And if any of you get to come to NTU, I do hope it's a course that you'll be able to have the opportunity to take, because it's very interesting. It delves deeper and actually examines what exactly is the Malay ethnic identity. I think we are currently in a society where a lot of categories are kind of just inflicted on us, and sometimes we just take everything in our stride without actually examining and like thinking, hey, why is this, like what is race and what is ethnicity, and why do we have such constructs and why do we accept them so easily? And I think another aspect of this class that was really interesting was that we looked beyond like the typical sources that is always heavily referred to and referenced to in when we talk about the Malay world. So obviously we always talk about the Sejarah Melayu and the Malay annals, but the professor who ran this class, which is Prof. Faiza, she also allowed us to look at more different type of sources. We looked at coins, we looked at seals, we also looked at different hikayats and the translation of these hikayats and how this kind of differed in the different time periods. And this actually all links back to the question itself of Malay identity and how it's fluid and how there's so many different constructions of it. So it was really something that interested me, because with prior to this, like we always just especially in Singapore, a lot of people just identify as Malay, but not everyone is actually aware of like the ethnic origins that specific to themselves. So some people who identify Malay are actually, Bugis people, and they just kind of classify themselves as Malay because that's what we have kind of been simplified to. So that was one of the more interesting modules that I took. And I do hope that if any of you come to NTU, you'll find modules that interest you, that, I do think we have plenty of interdisciplinary history modules that are quite out of the norm, and it might scare you at first, but when you take it, it's actually quite interesting because you're looking at how various disciplines kind of play into history as well. And we have a lot of professors here who have interest in very different areas and are very knowledgeable in what they do. So yes. And
can I add one thing, just picking up on that? I mean, I think that it just reminded me of something that I think, when we think about what classes we have and what's interesting, one of the things that I didn't perhaps stress so much is not just the topics, right? It's not just like the diversity of topics, which I think is, very a kind of brand of what we do, the kinds of this very diverse kind of history and this very diverse approach to history. But I would also say the way we kind of organize things in the classroom as well. So that goes everything from the kind of sources, as Samantha was saying, the kind of sources that we look at, right, which may include like films or even buildings, right, material culture, material stuff as sources. Also that I know that Prof. Hinchy organizes one of her courses entirely as a kind of semester-long game, where the object of the game is to decolonize India. So everyone plays a kind of role. Either you're the British or the kind of you're the Prime Minister of India, or right. I mean, everyone has their kind of character in the game and you have to negotiate, right? And you see whether you end up, what kind of independent India you end up with, right? And so this is that kind of novel approach, I think, is something that is quite unique to us as well, and hopefully, we think adds, something different and something interesting about what we do as well.
Okay, so the last question for today's session, which was given during the registration process by one student, was, what can I do with a history degree? I do believe Prof. Harlem actually touched on certain aspects of this, so I'm going to let Matthew elaborate a bit on what he thinks he can do with his history degree.
Thank you for the question. Okay, so I think since I think what has been described, I mean, like Prof. Harlem's actually described, what are the possible future career prospects. So I'll just let you know on what I know of my senior or like, current history undergrad, like where have they went to after graduation. So I have a senior now who is actually currently working in MAS, Monetary Authority Singapore, as a management associate. And also, I do have seniors who are in MOE, teaching history at secondary school and JCs. And also, I do have seniors who are working as an ICA officer, working in enforcement, working in the police force, and quite a couple of them are working in Ministry of Foreign Affairs as foreign service officer. So we can see that there's a really huge a huge variety of possible employment options for you to go to, and it's not restricted to a few. Yeah.
I think, and just to wrap up the question, I don't think you have to feel restricted or limited to the sort of traditional fields that are typically associated with history. Not that there's anything wrong with those fields, but I think nowadays it also kind of depends on which skills you wish to emphasize on upon graduation and how you can match or tailor this to your scope of interest or field in the future. So I do think that you should keep this in mind. And if you ever need help while you're in NTU, we do have a very capable career guidance office who can help you with this if you face any difficulties. So with that, I would just like to thank everyone for attending today's session, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any more questions about our history program, do chat with us via the live chat app on the Open House microsite, or you can sign up for one of our virtual interactive sessions between 22nd February to 26th February. The schedule is available on the Open House microsite. So thank you once again, and thank you, Prof. Harlem, for today's lecture and for being with us and answering these questions.
No problem.
Thank you, Matthew, as well.
Thanks to both of you too.
So thank you all, and I hope you all have a great day.